Paul, we're in Dubbo. What's this museum?
It's telling the story of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, an absolutely unique thing in all the world, and Australia's been gifted with it.
Yeah, what's this plane? Why is this important?
Well, it's a reminder of how the Flying Doctor Service began with just simple planes like this back in the late 1920s, early 1930s, as a way of reaching into the wilds of inland Australia to help people who were living in isolation.
Now you lived in Bourke for a number of years, but if you went 50 years before you were there, when Bourke was first settled, what was your options if something went wrong?
Well, I had a mate he told me his grandmother, before the turn of the 20th century, she lost 9 out of 13 children living 100 miles out of Bourke. Imagine how much heartbreak there was in that family. Incredible.
And 100 miles out of Bourke, you had nothing, didn't you?
If you were on your own, husband was away droving or shearing or something, you got 5 or 6 kids, one gets sick, what do you do? You know?
Most people would think that therefore the government came up with some way of fixing this problem, but the Royal Flying Doctor Service was not started by the government.
Not at all, no, it grew out of the imagination of one young bloke actually, yeah.
Wow, who was that?
John Flynn, and he lived in backcountry Victoria around Horsham before the turn of the 20th century, son of a school teacher. Got a heart, at 16 he got a call from God. He felt, I want to do something for Australia. And he went to Bible college, didn't do all that well. They sort of fluffed him out the door. He ended up a circuit preacher in Gippsland. And
so what's a circuit preacher?
Well, in John Flynn's case, he was riding on horseback in sort of timber country in Gippsland, running Sunday schools, maybe church services for bush people in lonely, isolated places. And one of the skills he developed was photography. He was a really good photographer, and there's a whole lot of his photographs in the National Archives, but he saw that he could use photographs to tell stories, and he used what was magic lantern shows in those days and those funny little things, and he'd take them back into the cities to explain to city people how tough life was in the bush.
Now, a lot of people would be going, this is not a good place to work, I want to get to the city where it's easier, but he actually developed this whole vision and ministry for people who are isolated.
Well, he actually went to an even tougher assignment. Somebody talked to him about going to the back of South Australia.
Wow.
So that's where he sort of cut his teeth, I suppose, in the back of South Australia. Then he got a letter from the Northern Territory, came to the Presbyterian Church from a lady called Litchfield, Jenny Litchfield, sent him a letter saying, things are really rough up here. The blokes take the Aboriginal girls, the church is absent, where are you? We need help up here. And also Jeannie Gunn, who wrote Weave the Never Never, wrote him a letter and said, we need men like you up here.
Yeah. What did he start to do?
Well, initially, of course, there was no planes. This is before the First World War. He'd written a letter to his dad at 21, said, you know, Dad, if the gospel of Jesus is the real thing, we need to find a way of expressing it to the people of the bush. It's no good building churches out here. They need hospitals. So he could see that medical help was the big thing. And he developed this little book called The Bushman's Companion, which is brilliant. He had recipes, he had how to run a burial service, he had poems.
Who writes a book that has how to do a burial service and a recipe and a poem in the same book?
And right at first aid, all in here, and then a very clear statement about following Jesus. So that was the beginnings of the Flying Doctor Service. It grew out of that little book.
It's very interesting, Paul, because that is an intriguing overlap, isn't it, of somebody who's practical, but also has a heart for the message of Jesus.
Exactly. He borrowed a saying from another missionary, Wilfred Grenfell, over in Canada. He said, if you want to commend your gospel to men, you first of all do something for them that they understand.
Yeah.
And he was following Jesus in this, because Jesus did things for people, you know, and then the message sort of flowed out of what he was doing. And I think that's what Flynn saw. He said, you do things for the bush people, then they'll listen to you.
Yeah. Now, the Royal Flying Doctors had a few kind of hurdles to get over. One was clearly planes, but the other is actually communication.
Yeah, well, the two things. I mean, the planes like this, Hudson Fish, who began Qantas up in Longreach, he came on side quickly to help Flynn develop this idea. And then the guy from Sunshine Harvesters in Victoria, H.V. Mackay, these men came on side with money, with resources, with know-how about using planes. And they worked on this idea of you can slide a patient in that side
So
door
the
there.
patient comes in the door.
Through the side door there, and the doctor climbs in there, pilot's sitting outside, and off they go. So it was pretty basic, but it was ingenious. And Australia, of course, is God-given to flying, as Nancy Bird told me once. She said, this country's God-given to flying because there's not a lot of mountains to bump into, it's all flat, So it certainly suited the Outback. The original idea, I should say, came from a young guy who was going to the First World War. He wrote a letter to Flynn, Clifford Peel. He said, I think we could use planes as ambulances, and he died in the war, so he didn't get to see it, but Flynn ran with it. That was his genius. He could take an idea and then he'd find people who could help him make it happen. So it's Hudson Fish or it's H.V. Mackay. And he was a great mobiliser of men, and he was a great storyteller.
Yeah. It's one thing to say, okay, we've got this patient, but if the patient is a long way away, there's no telephone system, no electricity. So one of the things Flynn had to deal with was communication.
Absolutely. One of his brilliant stories was a young guy who was injured in the back of Western Australia. His mates dragged him in on a cart 100 kilometres to a telegraph station. Telegraph operators on there giving Morse code to Perth, 2,000 kilometres away. Doctors on the Morse code on the other end. You'll have to operate. What have you got? I've got a razor blade and some Condy's crystals. So 2 men held him down. This bloke does this operation on this guy's gut.
On Morse code?
On Morse code, getting instructions from Perth. Perth, meanwhile, the doctor gets on the boat. He's 12 days getting up there, and when he gets there, the bloke had died that morning before he got there. So Flynn took that story and he told it all over Australia, saying that's why we need flying doctors.
Yeah. How did they overcome the communication issue?
Well, he went to AWA, who were the big knobs in radio, and he said, I need this, and they said, I'll be decades before we get anything like that anybody can use out there in the bush. He said, I haven't got decades, I need it now. So he found a young radio nerd down in a little shed down the back of Adelaide, a guy called Alfred Traeger, and together they sort of loaded up the Dodge and with all this gear, it's amazing the pictures, and drove off into the back country of South Australia, across Queensland, putting aerials up trees, driving the generator off the back wheel of the car, trying to invent something that people could use, until one day Traeger hit on this idea of pedals. We'll use pedals. So the pedal radio came into being, and that gave the dumb bush a voice, as somebody said. So women who were living in the bush on isolated stations suddenly could find safety and communications. What an amazing gift that was.
So the pedal produces the power, like a bicycle pedal, and then they can use the Morse code with the pedal.
Yep.
Now the intriguing thing is we think about that for the Flying Doctor Service, but it actually had all sorts of uses, didn't it?
Well, as they developed it, of course, it grew into more sophisticated radio sets, and then they got the idea of, well, kids could do lessons, because one of Flynn's great dreams was to make the bush habitable for families, and with families would come the expansion of industry, and had a softening effect on the bush, because blokes can live like dogs in the bush, but the women can't. And so his goal was to bring a civilising effect that women can bring to the bush, softening effect, and to equip them with radio and school was brilliant, you know. So the School of the Air grew out of that. It's now distance education. Yeah. But all these things came out of a little idea like this that grew, one seed, and what it spread to.
We started with one plane, with the Flying Doctor Service. What has it developed into?
Well, right now there's 77 aircraft, about $10 million a piece, flying ambulances, and it's an amazing thing. My little grandson was flown from Bourke to Dubbo to Sydney and back twice in a month. Probably, I said to my daughter-in-law, maybe 70 medical people have worked on your little boy in that time. Where else does that happen in the world? So they're the sorts of things that happen. But along with that comes, there's clinics they run mental health clinics for people in the bush, because isolation, depression, suicide's very present out there. Dentistry, so you get clinics are set up in different small towns, and people sign in, and the Flying Doctor will come in for the day, and so they serve the people like that as well.
What was, at the bottom level, Flynn seemed to have a couple of key motivators. What were they?
Well, as I said, it began with his heart to serve God, but then he could see that it wasn't enough just to sort of preach sermons. he needed to express a sermon. So from the smallest detail, if he was on a station, he would stop to fix somebody's clock, or he'd teach his padres to, if you're going to be on the station, don't just preach to the men, go out and work with them. And then at night, learn to smoke a pipe, because when you pull out a pipe and the men pull out their pipes, they're ready to talk. He could read the needs of the people down to the smallest detail, and also to see the big picture. That was his genius, and to mobilise people to do things. The second thing that Flynn did, and this came out of his heart for pastoral care, was that he put not only just a mantle of safety medically across Australia, but he put a mantle of safety spiritually across Australia. So there was a second level of care, and that was the padres that he put on the ground who travelled all across the backcountry, visiting stations and visiting people and looking after their needs. So, and then dotted all across the outback, of course, were small hospitals, like in Inaminka or somewhere like that. And he put 2 girls usually together, so they weren't too lonely, and they would be serving a whole region there. So some very brave women went out there to serve with Flynn. And they didn't just run hospitals, they ran Sunday schools, they ran libraries, they sort of brought a whole level of community around the hospital. And that was one of the great gifts he gave to the lonely, isolated people of the bush.